And without much further ado, I'd like to head over to our keynote speaker, Wendy. Wendy, please come on stage. And I don't know how many of you are following Wendy Nather on Twitter. I've been doing that for several years, and I always thought that is a different voice on Twitter. Wendy is a voice of sense and reason on Twitter, and that is rare on Twitter in the IT security community. And I was delighted to see that she's also talking about supply chain security. And oh, now we have a topic that fits one of the greatest speakers we could have. And she was very nice in agreeing, committing to come to Switzerland immediately when I asked. So I'm very happy to hand this over to Wendy Nather of the Duo, or now Cisco CISO Advisory Board. She runs a team of people like her. And it's going to be a very interesting talk introducing us all to supply chain security. Thank you very much, Wendy.
Guten Morgen miteinander. Ich freue mich schon riesig, wieder hier in der Schweiz zu sein, wo es für mich vor vielen, vielen Jahren alles angefangen hat. Sag mal, redet man immer noch von EDV-Sicherheit? Elektronische Datenverarbeitung, was sagt man das noch? Erinnert sich man an das? Nicht, okay. Ja, es waren schon vor 25 Jahren, dass es hier in der Schweiz war. Und ja, ich freue mich wirklich riesig, wieder hier zu sein. Es wird allerdings viel lustiger, wenn ich versuchen würde, alles weiter auf Deutsch zu machen, also lustiger für euch. Aber in the interest of being clear, I will do the rest of this in English. I want to give a special shout out to my friend and colleague Elliot Lear, who is here. He's with Cisco, and we had not seen each other in 30 years. We met on a hacker mailing list in the mid-'80s, and we have not seen each other since, so I'm just so happy that he's here today. I want to talk about the end consumption of supply chain security data, because I feel as though there are plenty of talks, and you're going to hear a lot of them today, about how to produce that data, how to generate it. SBOMs are the new hotness, everybody loves that. But I want to think about, well, okay, now that you have this data, what are you going to do with it as a practitioner, as a CISO? So that is going to be the aspect for my talk today. Now, when you are trying to figure out whether you trust your supply chain, when you're trying to verify it, you often think about it in terms of vetting the people, vetting the process, and vetting the technology. And so that's how I'm going to break down this data. For people, a relationship means a lot, more than you would think, when you are trying to decide whether you trust a vendor, whether you trust a colleague in open source that you're working with. The relationship and the reputation matter a lot, but it's very hard to measure that data. It's not machine readable. The incentives of that person, of the vendor who wants your business, or the incentives of the person who is running the project, that matters a lot too. Of course, their expertise, but I see people arguing over expertise all the time. So again, that's hard to measure for the most part, and their influence. How much can they actually make happen? What can they get done? You often talk with vendors who say, well, there's not much we can do about this because we're not responsible for that part, and things like that. But we do have data like certs to be able to measure a little bit of the people aspect of the supply chain. And that's why when you're doing RFPs or anything like that, you often ask for personnel just as a shorthand to have certain certs, because at least you can point to those and say, yes, at least they've gotten that far. And it saves you time from having to interview everyone that's involved with your project to find out what their expertise is. Now, from process, a lot of people think about the org chart. This is not a real org chart, but it might as well be. On top, there's somebody to get fired. That would be the CISO. And then you have managers. I actually show this to salespeople in Cisco to explain what a security organization is really like. And then there are people who hit keyboards and say bad words. So we look at the org chart as a function of whether we can trust that supply chain supplier. But it's really about their knowledge, their controls, and their practices. And guess what? We've actually become pretty good at getting certification for all three of these. You can get them ISO certified. You can, again, they can show you all of their SOC 2 audit results for all the controls that they have. All of their practices. Do you practice this? Do you do this? Do you use this framework? Yes, yes, yes. So we are always working to try to get shorthand to get standardized data that we can use to evaluate our suppliers. And then their technology, of course, looking at the infrastructure that they have, the tools that they use, whether they're using things that are configured properly. And we've run into that with supply chain breaches recently. And then the components. And that's where it gets really interesting because, of course, we have certs for configurations. And now we have SBOM for software components. But the question is, what do you do with the data? Let's say you go to a vendor and say, I want an SBOM. And they say, great, here you go. Now what do you do? So the sources of supply chain security data usually come in the form of assertions. If you give a vendor a questionnaire that they have to fill out, you look at the answers, and sometimes it's only about whether they can give you the answers or not. Because if they hesitate and say, well, that's proprietary, or, yeah, we don't think that's very important, then you know you probably are not going to trust them. When I was working for the Schweizerische Bankverein 25 years ago, the insurance people would ask me the same questions as the security person that they are asking today for insurance. That has not really changed. Some of the frameworks have changed, of course, some of the certifications, but the questions about how do you handle software development, how do you handle change control, that really hasn't changed all that much. There are audits and certifications, there's testing, scanning, penetration testing, and so on. And then there's monitoring, active monitoring of your supplier, and sampling, where you might go in and just look at data or the quality of something as it comes through the supply chain, just to make sure that, statistically speaking, everything is pretty good. Excuse me. I need my vodka. But notice that most of these are always point-in-time data, point-in-time information, except for if you can do real-time monitoring, that would be great. And if you're doing sampling, you can do that anytime. But just about everything else is going to be point-in-time data. So you're going to think about it in terms of three different things that you will do with this data. You will use it for risk management, to say what do we need to take action on, what do we need to change or mitigate or stop using. We need accountability. Sometimes the only accountability you have with your supplier is in the contract. And you go back to them and say, you said you were certified for this, but you're not following those certification practices. So it's really for liability. And then there's notification. If you're in the middle of a supply chain, you have to pass on what information you have that you get from somebody else. Yes, we further vet our suppliers just like you're vetting us, and we see that network effect in some types of vetting for supply chain security today. So let's look at SBOMs just as an example. You're going to hear a lot more about SBOMs from Patrick Dwyer. He is like the master on this, but I'm just going to look at it from the CISO side. In case somebody is not sure what a software bill of materials is, it's basically an ingredient list, a list of the software components. This is just a very bare example, and there's still a lot of negotiation going on as to what is actually going to be included in an SBOM. But basically, there's an artifact ID that identifies something like an executable or a container, any kind of file that is being delivered in software. And then there's metadata, like the name of the vendor or the responsible person, the release version, hopefully contact information, license and copyright. So what can you do with this? As a CISO or as a practitioner, one thing you can start doing with an SBOM is if it comes with the licensing metadata, you can avoid licensing conflicts or duplications. And that's not even really a security thing. That is to make sure, no, we can't put this in our software because it has a GPL. Or we will never ever, or you might say, for companies that are as large as Cisco, you might find that different business areas are all buying the same software from the same vendor, and you might want to consolidate all that licensing to save money. That's another business reason why you might want to use an SBOM. Of course, you want to check the provenance. That's another thing that you might be able to agree on with your management. We will never use software from North Korea. We will never, use this component because we already know that it has a bad reputation. Then you can also look at an SBOM and start talking with the provider about big ticket vulnerabilities. Like, this SBOM is already associated with this really bad vulnerability. What are you doing about it? The problem is that if you're doing this in the pre-procurement process, that is going to start taking negotiation. And you'll be holding up the procurement, and you will have a vice president on the phone with you saying, I don't care what's wrong with it, I need this software, get out of the way. So it's very difficult to step in and start talking vulnerabilities before the procurement happens. So really save that for very, very important things. It's easier at this point to focus on what you all agree that you can stop or flag immediately. A very unambiguous part of the SBOM, something that everybody knows, yes, it says North Korea, we're not getting it. Automatic no. Those are the easier things to be putting in front of procurement. The rest you may need to deal with after the procurement has been done. Some people wonder whether you can use SBOMs now instead of SDLC questionnaires or instead of pen tests. My answer is no, because pen tests find very, very different information, very different vulnerability information than would be linked to an SBOM, or at least if you're doing the pen test right, it would. SDLC questionnaires, again, they kind of measure the maturity, the capability, the willingness of the vendor to answer the questions, not just there's this vulnerability. And remember, if there is no vulnerability associated with that SBOM, it doesn't mean there aren't any. It just means they haven't been found yet, or they haven't been reported yet. So you still want to use all of these different techniques when you're evaluating your supply chain security. It's just that SBOMs are going to be an additional one. So let's talk about risk and vulnerability management. Now, we've been doing vulnerability management for a long time. Just because we can do them now with an SBOM doesn't mean this is new. One of the first things is somebody else's criticality rating on a vulnerability is not going to be yours necessarily. It may be that we don't call that function that's associated with that vulnerability, so we don't care. Or we have it mitigated because of this and this other thing. So you can never really take the criticality rating as an unambiguous signal that you should not be using this component, especially if you already have the component, then it's kind of late. One interesting thing that we learned when I saw this report from Scientia, the Scientia Institute in Kenna, if you don't know the Scientia Institute, two of the people who founded that were ones who also founded the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report. So they're excellent data scientists. They came out with reports called Prioritization to Prediction about the different ways you can prioritize remediating vulnerabilities and whether that is an effective method for choosing what to patch and what not to patch, because you can't remediate everything. And they found, and this really blew my mind, they found that any given prioritization method, whether it's criticality, whether it's being exploited right now, how old it is, how new it is, how widespread it is, which types of components it's affecting, using any one of those is no better than random chance for choosing which vulnerabilities to remediate. That's just crazy. They found that if you took all of the methods together and used all of them for prioritizing, then you might have something that's better than chance. But it's still very difficult to prioritize the vulnerabilities that you need to address. And of course, with any vulnerability, you have to be able to annotate, and that includes in an SBOM, what's really definitely affected and what isn't. And you have to be able to mark that somewhere, and you might be able to say, yeah, we're not calling that function right now, but in the future, if we ever do, then we have to take note of this vulnerability and we have to do something about it. So in any audit, we already know this. Everybody's already living this. You have to be able to say, yes, we know about this. This is what we evaluated it as. This is what we're doing about it. This is how it's being mitigated, and so on. Now, what can we learn about patching? Do we patch or do they patch? And again, this varies widely depending on the supplier. Sometimes you are not allowed to touch what they have supplied to you. I remember some Bloomberg systems that were actually infected with viruses, and they wouldn't let us do anything about it because we were not allowed to touch those particular systems. Do we wait? If it's open source, who do we wait to see if they fix it? What's the disposition on that? I'm sure you already have a system for figuring that out. You're going to use that again for SBOMs. That's no different. And what are the risk and the impact of partial remediation? Let's say this instance of this vulnerability we can patch next week, but these other ones are going to take 6 months because we have some other dependencies that we have to fix first, and we have to make a note so that we remember in 6 months that we've got to do it, and so on. Again, these are not new things. These are just going to apply even more to an SBOM. You're going to need more remediation and update processes to assess the dependencies, because SBOMs are going a level lower than you're probably used to with your supply chain data today. It's different from just knowing there's a new iOS version out and everybody needs to update. Looking at it component by component is going to be even broader, even deeper, even more complicated. So whatever you're doing today, if you start using SBOMs, you're going to have to do even more of it. So just keep that in mind. Now, what can we learn from threat intelligence? Do you trust the SBOM? Now, when I was working for the Retail and Hospitality ISAC, the Information Sharing and Analysis Center, I found that a lot of the threat intelligence that came in was evaluated based on whether the analyst trusted the source. Whether they said, yeah, they know what they're talking about, or no, don't even bother looking at this one. It's just going to waste your time. So the big question is going to be with SBOMs as well. Who can you ask if you have technical questions? Because the SBOM by design is going to be as brief as possible. It's not going to have all the information that you necessarily need. That's why the contact information part of the SBOM is going to be so important. You're going to need to be able to talk to somebody about it. Now, let me mention about scanning. I know that there are organizations out there who want either to have the source code of the software that they are being given by a provider so that they can test it or review it themselves, or they at least want to scan it themselves. But I can warn you, from within Cisco, we have been using SBOMs internally for several years already for our own purposes. And we actually looked at what we could scan in the source code versus what we could scan with one of our binary scanning tools. And we found that the binary scanner was only about 60% accurate. And I've heard people claim that they can be as much as 90% inaccurate, that binary scanning is just not the same as static source code scanning. Now, we can argue about this afterwards. I would love to have a good argument over drinks. But just keep that in mind. If you do not have the source code and you're going to try to do your own scanning of the binaries to try to find out your risk because you don't trust the provider's SBOM, you're likely to come back to them with a report of something that doesn't actually exist. And as a provider where we get a lot of bug reports, and I'm sure the bug bounty folks can also agree with this, there are some people who come with a great report and you say, oh yes, we didn't see that, that's great, thank you, we're going to work on this. And then there are others saying, I don't think you really understand how this works. Thank you for bringing this, but really this is not a problem. But either way, it's going to take a lot of time. So I just want to caution you about scanning something if you don't trust the supplier. It could lead you down the wrong trails. The other thing you need to think about is who really needs this information and who just needs an FYI. There are going to be people in your organization, when they get an SBOM, they're going to want to look at everything, they're going to want to examine it very carefully, and that's great. Then there are others who really don't need to do that. They don't need to know about it. Think carefully now about who should be receiving all the information and who should be spending their time digging out the details as opposed to somebody who just needs an FYI. And then finally, every time I talk to somebody about SBOMs, they get really excited about the idea of tracing all of these components and making social graphs and very fancy things about how broadly this is used. And I think, yeah, that's great. That's fun. It's really cool. And if you find that there is some component that is now, a vulnerable component is being used by half of the civilized world, that'll make a great talk at Black Hat. But what are you really going to do with it as a practitioner, as a CISO? If you see this, this vulnerable component, is it going to change whether you rip it out? How much work is that going to be? How are you going to explain it to your management and so on? So yeah, social graphs are fun, but are they really going to be useful? I am not convinced. But again, I'm willing to be convinced. The other thing that people say with SBOMs is we're going to make them machine readable and we're going to automate mitigation or remediation. As a former CISO, I am not convinced of that either because, especially in application security, blocking is breaking. Even if you do the mitigations very, very carefully, usually the organization is very nervous about doing anything that might block something in the application stream because they don't necessarily know what effect it's going to have. They don't know what it's going to do. There are so many organizations out there that have legacy code that nobody knows for sure what they do anymore. And they really are very, very nervous about taking any action. That's why when I was an industry analyst, I believe the number was only about 10% of organizations that had web application firewalls actually turned on any blocking. Only 10%. Everything else was in logging mode. Because with an application, you may not know what's going to happen for years, because there may be certain conditions that only happen, that are only triggered, certain pages that are only touched once a year, once every couple of years, during a triple options expiration day. There are a lot of things that may not happen very often. So use automation with caution. I don't think the answer is going to be, we're going to get SBOMs, they're going to be machine readable, we're going to send them straight to the firewalls and everything will be great. And yes, I know I work for Cisco and I probably shouldn't be saying that you're not going to use firewalls. But let's be real here. Blocking is breaking. You have to use automation with caution. So my philosophy for automation is that it goes best with certainty, precision, transparency, and commitment. By certainty, I mean you'd better be sure that you want the automation to do what take the actions that you're making it do. With precision, You want to make sure that you have scoped it carefully and it is only going to have effects on the things that you want, not on the dependencies. And you need transparency. Everyone needs to understand what the automation is for, what it's intended to do, what inputs it's supposed to react to, and what actions it's supposed to take. Even people who are not actually using the automation need to understand this. And then finally, commitment. If you're going to use automation, you'd better be prepared to set it up and let it run, not come back to it every week and tweak it a little bit because, no, we didn't really want it to do that. That's not really automation. That's just a shell script or, whatever. And then finally, notifications. We're going to use SBOMs and other supply chain security data for notifications. You need to know the limits of your supply chain data. So for example, let's say you get a vulnerability notification on some component in an SBOM. Or let's say that you have a breach that you've just discovered that's been going on for 6 months. Can you actually figure out which version of that software was in use in each location on every system 6 months ago? Like from which date to this date? Do you have that amount of information in your logs? I'd like to see a hand if somebody does have that. I'd be really impressed. Really, really, really impressed. No, nobody has that. Not for 6 months ago. So think about this when you're thinking about SBOMs and you're going, okay, now we know that there's a vulnerability in this component. Can we figure out when it was in use? And do you know enough about how each component is used to be able to know whether it was really exploited? That's the other hard thing about forensics. Especially if you're not logging every read event, you don't know whether somebody looked at the data or not. So that's another big problem with SBOMs. Again, that this is not going to be solved by having a new set of vulnerability reports come in. And if you don't have that information, then unfortunately you suspect a breach, but you're not sure, you can't rule it out, then you're going to have to notify, and this is why your legal team is going to cry. Because now you have a new source of information coming in the form of SBOMs that says, we might have had a problem, but we're not sure. No, we can't figure it out for sure. I'm sorry. Yeah, it's going to make them very upset. So again, you need to have a good talk with your legal team if you're going to start using SBOMs, because you're going to have to be able to notify, you're going to be able to respond to any disclosure of a vulnerability. If you don't have that process in place right now for your software, you better get it really fast. And what about SaaS providers? If you are talking to a SaaS provider and you want to see their SBOMs, and their SBOMs have SBOMs, and their SBOMs have SBOMs, how far are you going to ask to see their information? How many levels deep are you going to go before you're satisfied? You better be ready to draw a line there. I think, I don't know if Trey's here yet this morning, but when Trey Hare is going to be speaking, he said he was going to give me an SBOM for his talk that showed 3 dependencies on my talk. So Trey, I hope this is the talk that you thought you were going to follow. Good luck. The problem is that you are not going to get all the details that you want. You're going to hit a wall at some point. Either it's you've been 5 SBOMs deep into researching something and you still can't decide whether you feel good about it or not. So again, these are the sort of things you have to decide now. The other problem is it's not a supply chain. We always think when we talk at conferences about supply chains, we think of an end consumer, usually a large bank, that is just taking everything in and saying, yes, we like this, no, we don't like that. But it's not really like that. There's no end. There's no terminal point at the end of a supply chain. We are all supplying to one another all the time. No matter how big you are or how small you are, things are passing through. There are dependencies, there are interactions, transactions, and so on. So we are all dependent on one another. And it's even worse when you're in the middle of a supply chain because you're getting things from one side and you're having to pass them on to another side. So prepare yourself for that role because it's going to get even more explicit when you start using SBOMs. So finally, I was going to talk to you about how not to drown in the data, and I don't know if I actually succeeded or if I just scared you a lot. I didn't mean to do that. But just make sure that if you're going to use any kind of this data for supply chain security, know what you're going to use it for. The risk and vulnerability management, keep that data close to you because you're going to use it the most. You're going to be checking it often every time there's a disclosure. That's the most dynamic data set. Accountability, where you went back and said, you know, you said in this that you were doing this, that's only going to be really necessary if something bad happens and you need to blame them for it. So, you know, you can keep that farther offline. You don't need to have that with all the other types of risk and vulnerability data. And notifications are going to be needed the most depending on where you are in the supply chain stream. Try to get a feel for where you are. How much are you going to receive and how much are you going to give? And I encourage you, especially with things like SBOMs, prioritize go and no-go decisions, very unambiguous data decisions first, that you can all agree with your management, with other departments, with the legal team, things that you can and will say no to. Those will be the easiest to do. Everything else is going to be negotiation. Document some general policy and processes for using the other data, but again, you probably won't be able to automate all of it. A lot of it is going to be judgment. It's going to be analysis. But the important thing to think about is that SBOMs represent a whole new layer of deep detail that many organizations might not be ready to handle. And negotiation, as I mentioned, negotiation cannot be automated. I want to leave you with a few resources, just in case, and I don't know if we'll be making the slides available or not, but the report that I was talking about with Kenna and Scientia, prioritization to prediction, that's a series of 7 or 8 reports, I think, but the one where I quoted it is in the first one. And if you're going to put SBOMs in a vendor contract, here's a US-based white paper on what you should be thinking about, what language you should think about putting in the contract if you're going to be asking for SBOMs. And then everybody knows ANISA. I don't think I need to point that out to you, but here's just an example of guidelines for supply chain security. And that's it. Thank you so much for having me here, and I will see you. Enjoy the rest of the conference.